Hello, I'm Joanne Gallagher, your Think.Future podcast host. In this episode, I'm thrilled to welcome back Ryan Colker, Vice President of Innovation at the International Code Council and Executive Director at the Alliance for National and Community Resilience. Join us in a minute as we explore cutting-edge developments and discuss strategies for creating safer, more resilient communities. This podcast is brought to you by ANCR, a global leader pioneering solutions and services to the construction and manufacturing industries to support digital transformation for the built environment and smart manufacturing. Visit arcons.world to learn more about how Arcons are helping organizations design, build, and solve through digitalization. From Arcons to you, welcome to our Think Future podcast series. Each week, we'll share conversations with industry leaders from around the world to find out how they're thinking future. Subscribe to Arcons Think Future to access more episodes, interviews, and profiles. Ryan Colker is the Vice President of Innovation at the ICC, where he helms the Energy, Resilience and Innovation Centre of Focus. He's also the Executive Director of ANCR, a national coalition dedicated to equipping communities with tools necessary to assess and enhance their capacity for resilience. Ryan brings a wealth of experience to the table. He's the editor of the insightful book, Optimizing Community Infrastructure, Resilience in the Face of Shocks and Stresses, and has an impressive academic background with a law degree from the George Washington University and a BA in Environmental Policy from the University of Florida. Today, Ryan will be discussing critical topics like designing resilient infrastructure and building for community strength. Get ready for an enlightening conversation. Hello, Ryan. Welcome back to the program. It's been over 2 years since we talked to you, so we're so happy to have you back. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. Really appreciate the opportunity to share what's been happening over the past couple of years.
Exactly. And a lot has changed. I'm sure you're going to update us all on what's happening in policy and regulation and the drivers for change. So for those who don't know your background from before, maybe you could give us a little introduction to the International Code Council and your position with the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, ANCR.
Yeah, so International Code Council is probably best known for the development of model building codes and standards that are used around the world, but also a lot of the support tools that make them work effectively. So really looking at products within the built environment and sort of whether they meet particular standards or requirements through things like product evaluation, work a lot with standard development on a whole bunch of different sort of topics relative to the built environment, and we can certainly talk about some of those. But also sort of looking at sort of opportunities to drive the building industry and the built environment forward. So looking at things like offsite construction or resilience or sustainability and sort of seeing what are the broad needs in that space and what can an organization like ICC do to help address those challenges. So my role at ICC is Vice President of Innovation. So I get to look at all the cool and fun things that are happening within the industry. I direct our Center of Focus on Energy, Resilience, and Innovation. So really looking at sort of the intersection of some of the key issues that we're dealing with, both as a building industry, but also society in general. So that's really fun. And then another hat I wear is at the Alliance for National and Community Resilience. So I serve as executive director there. And ANCR really came out of a recognition that resilient communities really require a holistic perspective. So when we first started ANCR, there were sort of some initiatives in the resilience space popping up, but they tended to be either sort of very discipline specific or sort of very focused on an individual aspect of infrastructure. So transportation, for instance. And we recognized that really getting to resilience requires a holistic perspective. So we identified actually 19 different community functions that lead to resilience. So cut across social, organizational, and infrastructural aspects of communities. And so you need to understand the resilience of each of those functions, but also how those various different functions interrelate. And so we're working on a series of benchmarks called the Community Resilience Benchmarks that really provide communities with that holistic picture. So another fun sort of opportunity to look at some of the intersections of various different policy issues to really better society and provide sort of better buildings, better built environments for communities and people.
And has that developed over the last few years? I'm assuming it has. So can you kind of explain the trajectory or what's happened since we last spoke to you?
Yeah, so lots of exciting things. So on the ANCR front, we've released 3 benchmarks now, one on buildings, one on housing, and one on water. We've piloted them with a couple communities here in the US, but also sort of engaging in some of the international conversations around resilience. Sort of more broadly, I think from the sort of ICC perspective, but also sort of the global perspective, we've seen a lot more attention on buildings as strategies to address the climate crisis, advance resilience. Lots of things happening at the international scale. So over the past couple of years at COP, which is the UN climate conference, there's increasing discussions around sort of buildings as part of the challenge and also part of the solution. So we've seen things like the buildings breakthrough move forward, and we can certainly dive into sort of what that means a little bit more. We've seen the Declaration des Chalots, which another thing that we can dive into a little bit more. But I think the real sort of exciting thing is that folks sort of across the global community sort of working on building issues are really coming together to address a lot of the challenges in a very holistic way. So I think that's really exciting. Love to dive in a little bit more.
So as you know, our cause is a partner with World Green Building Council, and we partner with their program, the Circularity Accelerator Partnership Program. And out of that came a playbook for the built environment for circularity, basically. And later, recently, last November, there was a circularity paper on water, or water guidance for resilience.
Well, I mean, I can jump in. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work at the global scale with WGBC on sort of advancing the ball relative to both climate adaptation and mitigation. So they've certainly been very active in COP. We're actually working on a few sort of pieces relative to the buildings breakthrough. So just for sort of a little bit of background, the buildings breakthrough was officially launched last year at COP28 and really brought together folks from 28 nations, plus a whole slew of private sector organizations to call for near zero and resilient buildings as the new normal by 2030. And so, if you think about sort of that goal, that's a pretty lofty goal, but one that we really need to accomplish. And so, engaging in sort of the background work of what are the policies, what are the strategies that really need to be in place to accomplish that. And so, sort of under the buildings breakthrough, there were sort of 5 priority action areas, areas where work really needs to happen. So one of those is around harmonization and sort of understanding what standards, codes, criteria, rating systems, sort of assessment tools are out there. And so WGBC is actually sort of leading the work of convening folks to really get that work done. And so we're certainly pleased to be part of that effort as a codes and standards developer, and some of the sort of conformity assessment tools against a lot of those codes and standards. Another area where we're working on, again, where WGBC is involved, is around capacity building. So ICC is actually leading priority action area 5 around sort of capacity building, both at an institutional scale. So what are sort of the mechanisms that need to be in place at the government level, at the professional society level, sort of that scale to move things forward, but then also what are the personnel needs? So, across the spectrum of the building industry, who do we need to have at the table? What skills and knowledge do they need to know? And so, we're leading the effort to sort of map map that out. And then, a couple other areas around sort of research and development, finance, which is also, definitely an important issue, help move that effort forward.
Sounds like that Buildings Breakthrough Initiative is a real strong lever then for developing resilience in buildings and the environment, the community environment. Can you explain what resilience means to you?
Yeah, so sort of at its core, resilience is the ability to withstand hazard events, and those could be, very acute events, hurricane, earthquake, wildfire or bushfire, those types of events. But it's also about, sort of the maybe more chronic events that folks are dealing with. So whether that's, a big employer, leaving a community, or addressing economic stress or food stress, in some communities. So really, it's about, sort of creating communities where people can survive and thrive, well. I think, sort of one of the pieces really at sort of the intersection of resilience and sustainability is really assuring that, the built environment that we're building today is really prepared for the events that we'll see in the future. The sort of expectations of, what the built environment would see, relative to hazards in the future is very different than what we've seen in the past. And so, how do we prepare buildings that could be around for 50 or 100 years to respond to those new events? And so I think that's, definitely a real exciting area within the resilience space.
And also the ability of people to connect to each other in times of stress or emergency, because people need to get together and in their local little groups and help each other, whether it's with food or with, figuring out what to do. You can't really depend on the emergency services all the time. You need to have strategies, and that depends on good infrastructure and how you can communicate under severe conditions. I think that's, for me, is part of resilience building, and how you design things can either hinder or help that process work well. Is there any thought being given to that side of things?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things we've seen, particularly relative to extreme heat events, is, sort of whether someone sort of survives from a heat event or, sort of does well is dependent on sort of their social connection, with the community. So I don't know if folks remember, there was a sort of extreme heat event in the late 90s in Chicago where several hundred people died. And so they went back and sort of went to look, sort of what were the various different characteristics, of those folks that died. And a lot of it was, sort of they were older folks who maybe didn't have sort of the social connections, with the broader community. They didn't feel comfortable, going to cooling centers, those sorts of things. And so, if we think about sort of resilience from the human perspective, the sort of social side of it, and sort of building communities and networks, and sort of assuring that folks feel sort of safe within their community is really important. So it's just as much about sort of the buildings as it is about the community. And I guess I'll mention sort of one other thing that we've seen on the building side is sort of growing interest in the concept of passive survivability. So, when you do have an extreme heat or an extreme cold event and the power goes out, how long can you effectively stay, within a building before it gets, too hot or too cold? And, a lot of that is a function of, passive design, thinking through sort of effectively, what are the opportunities to have, shelter in place.
And we have an aging population, so there are needs there with respect to people living with disability or living with dementia. Do you have any input there as far as the resilience piece goes?
Yeah. Ultimately, when we think about resilience, we need to think about it for the entire community. And so it's really recognizing, what are the particular needs that all folks, within the community have. So certainly, recognizing, disabilities, and maybe, particular accommodations that they may need for, evacuation, or again, just sort of feeling comfortable, in their spaces. I think one of the other sort of areas that we've seen sort of challenges or opportunities to address is around energy burdens. So particularly for vulnerable communities, they may spend 30% of their income on sort of housing and utilities, or it could be even higher. And so that certainly puts stress on individuals and families. So the choices we make about sort of buildings ultimately impact sort of what those energy burdens look like. So sort of lots of pieces around resilience. I think the other thing that we've seen, particularly on the ANCR side, is real opportunities to sort of engage communities from a variety of different mechanisms. So who are sort of the trusted voices within communities? It may not be government. It may be your religious institutions, for instance, but also being prepared to deliver messages in multiple different languages. So if you have a large population that doesn't speak sort of the language or speaks sort of different language and within the community, I think there's a real need to sort of have the translations available for key messages.
Funny you said that, because I was living in Sydney in an area where it was a lot of Vietnamese and Lebanese people, and the postman was the person that I helped me to communicate to one of my neighbors. You wrote the message down that I wanted to convey in Vietnamese.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you got to sort of figure out what the messenger is and how to engage with folks. So yeah, I think that's a great example.
So you talked about the Déclaration de Chalot, or Déclaration de Chalot, I suppose, in French. What is that?
It is French, and I don't speak French very well either. But really sort of recognizing the call from the buildings breakthrough last November, government of France really said, we really need to bring building ministers and others, sort of in this space together to really come to sort of common solution. I think, sort of one of the interesting things is, for the most part, sort of building ministers are sort of domestic focused. They're sort of working on, issues within, their own countries, and not necessarily sort of strategizing, sort of at a national scale or international scale, but sort of really recognizing the need. France brought together ministers, I think from about 30 different countries to talk about sort of big issues within the built environment. And so that happened last March. And so, sort of coming out of that convening, there was the declaration actually signed by 70 countries to really sort of identify the strategies that will help us move forward. So, things like codes and standards adoption, things like capacity building and training. And so really sort of, with the buildings breakthrough being some of that sort of institutionalization of, what are the steps that we can take to sort of move things forward. And so I expect that at COP29 coming up later this year in Azerbaijan, we'll see some of the results of sort of the buildings breakthrough and the declaration to sort of move the built environment forward.
I am assuming it's very closely related to the Paris Agreement then.
Yeah, I mean, sort of part of the recognition that, the built environment and buildings in particular are sort of behind in meeting, the goals, particularly in proportion to the amount of impact that buildings have. So, something like 40% of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with building. And so, we really need to be able to sort of tackle those emissions. The challenge is, at the same time, we continue to build, and we need to continue to build. But, sort of how do we assure that, we make the new buildings, more efficient, and we retrofit the existing ones to be, as efficient as possible? Because there's no way, we're going to reduce that 40% if we don't have, sort of very specific sort of goals and activities in mind to help, sort of address those particular challenges. And so I think that's really sort of where the conversation is headed now. is, sort of what are those key steps that are going to get us there?
So this leads me to the question about the intersection of sustainability and resilience, and how design and the tools that we use fit together. Was that discussed?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting sort of piece of the puzzle. So, initially, a lot of the sort of conversations at the international scale have been about climate mitigation. So how do we reduce emissions, as far as possible to, meet the Paris Climate Agreement? The sort of conversation over the last few years have actually shifted to be sort of more both climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So, really recognizing that we're already seeing the impacts of climate change, and even if we stop, sort of all emissions today, we'll be sort of dealing with the impacts, for a long time. And so, really sort of recognizing that adaptation and mitigation are sort of same challenge, and if we don't sort of address each of those sort of collectively, we're not going to get where we need to be. I think the other sort of interesting piece around the conversation is, there are, you only get to design a new building once. And so, have sort of limited resources available. And so how do you sort of balance, all of the sort of performance requirements, relative to sustainability, resilience, accessibility, sort of all of those pieces that are really important for buildings to deliver. And so, you really need the tools to be able to do that. And so, sort of really understanding all of the pieces, that go into building. So, things like building information models can certainly help to sort of manage all of that data and information. We're seeing things on sort of the environmental side around environmental product declarations to really understand sort of how our individual choices around particular products sort of influencing embodied carbon. And so, certainly being able to manage that is really key. And so, being able to have, access to those tools, using them effectively, is really important. One of the things that we've sort of embarked on with Standards Australia and NBS is really recognizing that there are sort of a lot of data tools currently available. Many of them focus on sort of individual sort of disciplines or individual life cycle stages. And if we're really sort of talking about the needs of sort of governments or ESG professionals, they really need a mechanism to sort of bring all of those pieces together into sort of a holistic platform. So we're really starting to explore sort of what does that look like, and how does that work, effectively. What we're working on, with Standards Australia and NBS is really sort of a universal data protocol. So how do you effectively sort of bring in different pieces of data, validate them, and then sort of use them for reporting requirements, for instance, or sort of internal planning, particularly for folks sort of outside the buildings industry. So what, your ESG professionals or building or regulators or, those sorts of folks.
Yeah, to make the reporting streamlined and easy, so the data just comes out of the project and into a report format almost. It would be nice to have that. We'll be back to the conversation in just a minute. In the meantime, here's a little bit more about our cons. Our cons has a mission to advance the efficiency, quality and profitability of project outcomes for its customers. Providing best-in-class technology augmented by its in-house developed IP and a full suite of professional services, our cons is trusted by over 40,000 customers globally. If you are looking for a digitalization and sustainability-focused partner to help you achieve your goals, join the thousands of construction and manufacturing customers globally who choose our cons as their digitalization partner. With more than 50 locations around the world, our cons can connect you to the right technologies and expertise, so you can improve your competitive position and increase profitability. Our cons has an industry expert to help you navigate the best pathway forward wherever you are on your digitalization and sustainability journey. Visit arcons.world to find out more. And now back to our conversation. What other new approaches are you seeing then out in the construction, manufacturing, and infrastructure? Are there, like design for assembly, disassembly, different approaches? Can you talk about what you're seeing?
Yeah, so one of the other sort of exciting areas, and I guess it's not other, it's all sort of interrelated, but is the offsite construction space. So, the building industry is dealing with a bunch of different challenges, whether that's, sort of workforce availability, delivery of, affordable housing, sustainability issues. There's a real opportunity to sort of transform how we think about constructing things. And so, offsite construction really provides an opportunity to sort of shift that dialogue. How do we be sort of more effective by moving, sort of larger and larger components of the built environment into the factory? And that, sort of leads to things like, design for manufacture, assembly, and disassembly. How do we sort of feed into some of the circular economy conversation? So, if we think about, sort of offsite construction and the ability to disassemble, that sort of addresses some of the challenges, within the reuse of materials. So that's definitely an exciting space. An interesting one we've sort of delved into a little bit is around AI, and I know folks are sort of playing around with that in the building space. We actually are using it to sort of assist folks in navigating code provisions. So, if you have sort of a general question about, what's the installation requirement, in my town, you can, ask the AI and it'll say, look at code section, whatever, to sort of, get that information. So I think that's certainly an interesting use at this point, probably, multiple different other uses as that conversation moves forward. So, how do you sort of take the code requirements and the building information model and sort of, run the building information model, through the code requirements? And I think one of the easiest sort of applications is around, egress and being able to sort of measure the width of doors. That's a pretty sort of straightforward. And so I think that's something that, AI can, probably check pretty easily. So I think that's definitely an application.
So how are the changes in global policy affecting the business case for sustainability at the moment?
Yeah, so we're seeing a few sort of different levers that are sort of being pulled to sort of address the business case. I mean, some of it is on the regulatory side. I mean, we're seeing sort of a lot of government policies, whether that's for sort of corporations at large to begin, sort of reporting on things like climate risk or, their impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. And, if you think about sort of almost any corporation, they have buildings in some form or another. So I think, sort of that feeds into the conversation. We're also seeing regulations around individual products. So, in the U.S. here, we're starting to see at the state level states requiring things like concrete, steel, asphalt, and glass to meet specific, greenhouse gas emission targets, and demonstrating that through things like EPDs. So, I mean, that's certainly going to have an impact. But I think beyond the sort of regulatory side of the equation, we're starting to see demand from developers who really are looking to create sort of Class A office buildings, which today means something sort of different. It means highly sustainable, even moving towards zero energy buildings, and to really attract that clientele, which is in a sort of very challenging real estate space post COVID. That differentiation is going to be sort of a huge opportunity. I think we're seeing younger generations calling for more focus on sustainability and resilience. I think there's broader focus on societal issues at large, the sustainability and resilience message sort of feeds into that as well. And so being able to demonstrate your sustainability credibility and your resilience credibility, I think is going to help move markets forward.
I know this is an obvious question, but what are some of the specific questions that a client will ask when they say, I want this sustainability outcome? What are they talking about specifically?
I think it depends on sort of the different developers, sort of what market they're in. But I think we're seeing an increased focus on zero energy buildings. However you define that, I think that's still a little bit up in the air. I think, I don't know that it's necessarily the way to go, but I think, folks they want sort of visible demonstration of, sort of their resilience or sustainability. And, sort of in the built environment, a lot of the sort of mechanisms that make sustainability and resilience work are, behind the walls and not, sort of super visible. So, you may get some questions around, sort of how do I demonstrate that I'm actually sort of, achieving sustainable outcomes. So, sort of things like, solar panels are, a mechanism to do that. I think we may see some more questions around things like indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality, particularly sort of relative to COVID. I think there's certainly, concern about indoor air quality. We're also seeing, I think in the U.S., but also, probably in many other places, sort of concerns about wildfire and wildfire smoke in particular. So smoke can travel many miles away. So, just a couple of years ago in New York City, we were getting the impacts of wildfire smoke from Canada. So I think that's going to be sort of a growing, sort of area of concern. Yeah, I think those are probably some good places to start. I think probably what designers and contractors will hear is I think sort of owners and developers will not know what they want. They will just say give me a sustainable building, and I think designers should be prepared to sort of have that conversation of what are your corporate goals? What are you trying to achieve? How long do you intend to have this building operating, and sort of what are the potential risks that you're concerned about now and into the future? So I think in many cases sort of designers hold the key to sort of help move the conversations forward, because owners or clients or developers really don't know the questions to ask.
Well, the most sustainable building is the one not built. So, like adaptive reuse of buildings, because of the waste, we're trying to reduce waste. So, if you're going to build a new building, how do we do it in a way that we're using the minimal amount of resources in the most smartest way? And then, if you're adapting in an old building, is even better, right? So, are you seeing a trend towards that in America?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in most of sort of your urban centers, they've got buildings that have been there, for a long time. I think one of the things that's sort of interesting, again, post-COVID is, people have left sort of the commercial office buildings. And so there's actually a lot of discussion around converting those into apartment buildings. And so we're seeing, a lot of discussion around, sort of how to do that. So, I think that's certainly one opportunity for reuse. I think, there's also, as we continue to sort of go down the road of addressing embodied carbon, which hasn't necessarily sort of been at the forefront of discussion, but, as sort of more and more folks start to sort of recognize the potential impact of embodied carbon, I think we'll see, sort of more focus on, using the buildings and the materials that we already have in place. I guess one sort of anecdote I can give: the city of Portland in Oregon actually sort of passed an ordinance that any residential structure built before 1940, you have to salvage at least a significant portion, of that building. So really sort of giving the direction that, we want materials to be reused. So I think, that's a real opportunity. It's a real message, to the industry to sort of think about, where are those opportunities to reuse the materials that, we've already invested in.
We touched into it earlier about digitalization as a tool. So how do you see it supporting the business case as an enabler for success in these ways?
Yeah, so I think, really being able to understand sort of what do you have in the, sort of retrofit space? What are the opportunities? And, you can test out sort of multiple different, options, figure out sort of what works best, with the space that you've got. And, you can think about things like cost. You can think about things like resource use. You can think about sort of the occupant experience. You can sort of use digital tools to really help in that case. I think in sort of the new build space, you also want to be able to sort of optimize, your use of materials, the user experience, sort of all of that. And so digital tools, really sort of set up the ability to do that. I think the other thing, that we touched on a little bit, but, it's not just about sort of, designing the building and walking away. I mean, that building is going to be used for, 50 or 100 years and maybe renovated, sort of multiple times. And so, sort of being able to set up a good data stream, from the very beginning, is key. And then, sort of being able to use that initial data stream, update it, sort of with as built and in operation, sort of data can really sort of keep that continuum moving forward. So, and then support feedback loops. So, if we know, how an initial design is being operated and is it meeting, the initial performance requirements, we need the data and the information to be able to feed back, to the original design team so we can continue to improve our built environment. And so, if you don't have the digital tools to be able to do that, you're not going to have that sort of effective feedback loop. And you're not really going to be able to sort of collect the data that you need to sort of continue to improve the built environment.
Another benefit of digitalization is this digital twin model where everyone can collaborate very early in the project and can work out the circular economy part of it. And, it's just so much innovation can happen when people are in early in a project. Everybody is involved, including even the residents. So this is very powerful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, how you lower your risk in a digital environment. You're not expending the resources. You're not putting people at risk. And so you can try out stuff and see, sort of what people latch onto. So yeah, I mean, it's a sort of low risk opportunity to be innovative and sort of move the needle.
What other leading examples do you have?
So I think one sort of interesting case that sort of brings together many of the things that we've talked about is the U.S. General Services Administration, which is sort of the landlord for all of the U.S. or most of the U.S. federal agencies. So courthouses, ports of entry, sort of all of those buildings, and they've sort of set up an ecosystem to help support sort of addressing a whole host of challenges. So they have requirements on the resilience front. I'll give you the flooding one, for example, where they need to incorporate potential future climate risk from flooding and build higher to address that. At the same time, they've set up requirements for what's called buy clean sort of provisions. So any cement, concrete, asphalt, and glass that GSA purchases, they've set specific limits on what that looks like. At the same time, they've recognized some of the benefits that offsite construction provides. So they've adopted standards to help support the efficient use of offsite construction. And so, sort of bringing all of those pieces together does a few things. I mean, it certainly addresses a lot of the challenges, that their buildings will face into the future, which, are hopefully there for, 100 years or so. but also, sort of really supports a movement towards an integrative process. So making sure sort of everybody's at the table from the very beginning, everybody's bought into, the performance requirements, and, sort of addresses, the sort of resource constraints that, we talked about earlier. So I think, that's a great example of, sort of an opportunity. I think the other sort of key thing to that is, sort of leadership from the government level, can help sort of drive the broader industry forward, sort of set the stage for, increasing sort of market capacity to address, the challenges. So it's sort of acting as that sort of pull to the industry. So I think that's more sort of a general, philosophy and approach. We've seen some examples of, sort of specific projects. One I'll sort of call to mind is Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital in Boston, built sort of right on the waterfront. But, they recognized that, sort of number one, they decided to build on the waterfront because of sort of the healing, sort of nature of sort of the natural environment, but also recognizing, sort of the challenges of potential storms and sea level rise, and sort of being able to incorporate, sort of design decisions relative to resilience sort of very early on into the project. So you're sort of locating, sort of critical components on, sort of higher floors, sort of having the sort of parking garage on the lower level being, sort of potentially sacrificial. So it can flood, it wouldn't be, sort of that big of a deal. And so, thinking about things like that, from the very beginning, I think is a, sort of really great example of, some of the opportunities that we have if we think about things sort of upfront and from a comprehensive and holistic manner.
I've just been talking to someone about the idea of sponge cities, where you build in slow release or, nature-based solutions to gather the water when it suddenly hits, and then slow release. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, we've seen, folks where there may have been sort of buildings previously in a floodplain, sort of demolishing them and, sort of making, public parkland that, in a non-flood event, they're great amenities for the community. But, if a flood does come, there's expectation that, that area will flood, and it's not a big deal. That's what it's designed to do. So, I think there's, lots of creative solutions out there.
Lots of gaps that what we can use as opportunities as well. But is there any opportunity or challenge right now that's top of mind?
I mean, I think we could talk a lot about sort of sustainability and resilience and the need to do both, but probably sounds a little easier than it actually is. And I think, often you have sort of maybe competing, sort of requirements. I mean, if we think about, indoor air quality, sort of one of the strategies is increased ventilation. But often, you need to sort of heat or cool that air. So you're paying, sort of an energy penalty and enhance, sort of greenhouse gas emissions for, that indoor air quality improvement. So being able to sort of balance, sort of those types of requirements is super challenging. The other one, which is pretty exciting, we talked sort of maybe separately about, reducing the operational energy of buildings and the embodied, sort of energy of buildings. And again, sometimes those are sort of competing strategies. And so how do we sort of bring those two pieces together to be able to sort of talk holistically about sort of decisions we make relative to the materials we use and what impact that has on building operations? So we're actually working with ASHRAE on international standard for the quantification of the whole life greenhouse gas emissions of buildings. So, sort of how do you make those trade-offs? How do you talk sort of a building, throughout its life cycle instead of sort of slicing and dicing it into, sort of individual stages, which, doesn't really give you the complete picture of, the impact of buildings. And so I think sort of wrapping our arms around sort of that sort of piece of it is really interesting, and I think one that will evolve over the next few years.
You've certainly got a lot to think about. So when you think future, Ryan, about shaping the built environment and the current trajectory we're on now, what excites you the most?
Well, I mean, as we've talked, I've got my hands in a bunch of different things, which is really exciting. I mean, I think the sort of most exciting to me is the sort of ability to bring all of these pieces together. As we sort of started the conversation, we build buildings for people and to address, the needs of society. And so, sort of being able to have sort of that conversation and recognizing that, sort of different people have different needs. And sort of being able to sort of provide for those needs in a way that sort of makes sense, is resource efficient, cost efficient, workforce efficient, sort of all of those pieces. So so that's sort of where I get to think about all of the fun stuff.
You're like a conductor pulling it all together. That's great. It's really been interesting to talk to you about what's been going on since last time we checked in. So thank you for coming on the show again and keep us informed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Appreciate the opportunity.
This podcast was brought to you by ANCR. ANCR is leading the digital transformation of the construction and manufacturing industries, providing best-in-class technology solutions from world-leading partners and their own in-house development software from the ANCR B-Smart portfolio for building, infrastructure and manufacturing, and a full suite of professional services. ANCR is a company that cares about creating and building a better world. Together we are working with industry and environmental experts, providing forums and platforms through our ANCR Think community to create conversations that matter to our future generations. We invite you to join in the conversation and participate in our Think community. Like and subscribe to our Think.Future newsletter to stay up to date with the latest innovations and conversations as we advance the digital journey for construction and manufacturing around the world. You can download our podcasts at arcons.world or from your favorite podcast platform. From ANCR Think.Future, thanks for listening.